place to deliver a successful transition to a net zero carbon future, taking account of the economic and social challenges that this poses, as well as the environmental and technological ones. Quick housekeeping note, we have two short panels this afternoon, so I won't have time for many audience questions, but if you have a burning question you would like to submit to the panel, please use the Q&A button, and please keep it brief. If you want to tweet out about what you are hearing, you can use the hashtag Steel Needs Europe Needs Steel, the industrial hashtag for their campaigns in this area. We're going to start with two short impulse statements from our hosts today, just to provide a little context for the discussion, and then two panels. The first will focus on industrial policy and climate. What are the key challenges? And the second on towards a low carbon, high skill, just transition. What framework for success in industry? So, first of all, though, it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Judith Girton-Darling, who is Deputy Secretary General of Industrial, to kick us off. Judith, over to you.
Thanks, Jackie, and welcome to this seminar, this joint seminar today, co-hosted with Eurofair. From our side at Industrial Europe, we have been calling now since May last year for a European steel action plan to ensure that we accompany the decarbonisation of our economy with a strong industrial and social agenda for our sector, because what we want to see is decarbonisation, but without deindustrialisation. And that means that we have to have an assertive and proactive agenda to ensure that we're maintaining steel working jobs in Europe. We need a just transition framework for our steel industry, which ensures that we leave no worker and no region behind. And be under no doubt, steel workers in Europe know that this is the single biggest issue facing them in the coming years, but we are facing it in the context of intense, fierce global competition. So we need to have an agenda at European level which really promotes our sector and gives us a path to that decarbonisation, taking everybody with us.
Thank you very much indeed, Judith, and lots to discuss there. How do we, as you say, have decarbonisation without deindustrialisation? What does a just transition look like? And particularly, what are the specific challenges that face this sector, already facing a number of challenges before COVID, much more dramatic now since COVID, to make sure it can contribute to the green transition? Lots to come back to. Delighted now to give the floor to our co-host for this event, Axel Eggert, Director General of Eurofair, the European Steel Association. Axel, great to see you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Jackie, and welcome to everyone to this joint event of Industrial and Eurofair. The European steel industry shares the ambition of the EU to decarbonize the economy by 2050. We have on our own the ambition for steel to be close to carbon neutral by 2050, but already in 2030, we want to reduce our emissions by 30% compared to 2018 levels. So this is a real ambition, and it is an industrial revolution. But the huge difference with previous technological developments is that this is not driven by the market. Decarbonization is driven by regulation, and therefore it's also, of course, the legislator that need to support the creation of markets for green steel or for decarbonized steel. That's very clear. If you cannot pass on the additional production costs for CO2 neutral steel, then actually you do not have a business case and you do not have a job either. And that's a big problem. Ton of green steel will maybe cost around about 200 euros more than conventional steel. So how can we compete with that in a market which is driven by a fierce global competition and by global steel overcapacity and massive imports and increasing imports? Since 2016, we have a reversion of the steel trade balance. Since then, we import more and more steel and less export. So what we need is to be able to make the fundamental investment decision. And that is only possible with a consistent regulatory framework. We need massive investment in innovation and new equipment. Already by 2030, we need to invest around about 26 billion euros to make the first steps to decarbonization. And that, of course, has an impact, an economic impact, but also we need to prepare the employees for this change. That's, of course, crucial because we will deploy new technologies. Of course, if you look into the last years, we have already reduced the capacity by 26 million tons in the last 10 years. We lost around 25% of jobs. And that is dramatic for such a sector, and we need to stop this trend. And of course, to go green is also an opportunity to stop this trend. And therefore, we need combined action. And I fully agree with Judith that we need a steel action plan. And there are distinguished speakers here today who can maybe help us. Let's bring together the legislator, the unions, and the employers, and to discuss how we can make this change, because one measure alone will not make the trick. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Axel. Lot to come back to in our conversation. How do we create that demand for green steel? Very struck by what you said. This is something driven by regulation, so you need the help of the legislators. What help? What does that look like? And how do we seize that opportunity, as you say, to stop the job losses? And not just to stop the job losses, but to ensure quality jobs as well. Lots to come back to. Let's move straight into our first panel, because as I say, ladies and gentlemen, lots to discuss and time is tight today. I am delighted to welcome joining Judith and Axel, who are going to stay with me throughout our discussions. Delighted to welcome Clara de la Torre, Deputy Director General in the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action, better known to most of us in Brussels as Klima, and Cristian Silviu Busoy, MEP, who is Chair of the European Parliament's Industry, Research and Energy Committee, the ITRE committee, to all of us. We are also supposed to be joined by Wendell Trio, who is the Director General of CAN Europe, the Climate Action Network. We don't see him, not sure if he's having problems connecting. Hopefully he will magically appear very soon. But in the meantime, I suggest we get underway and we'll bring him up to speed as and when he does. And just to say, I see someone has raised their hand to ask a question. Could I ask you today, just because of in the interest of speed, please can you do it in writing so that I can weave it in at the appropriate moment, and hopefully we can pick up on all your points. So Clara, let me start with you, if I might, in terms of how important is this? The point that's being made here, yes, it's a technological challenge. Yes, it's an environmental challenge, but it's also a huge economic and social challenge, particularly for the steel sector, given the challenges it's facing even without a green transition. How important is it to tackle all of those things do you need? And what do you see as the key challenges here?
Thank you very much. We are, thank you very much to Eurofair, Jackie, but the Eurofair and also the trade union representative, and they both speakers, they made very good and very important points, which are it's not up to me to judge them, but they are really at the core of the issues today. I think it's very important. I'm very happy that it happens today, because as you all know, this evening, during this night, the European Parliament, and I acknowledge the presence of the President of ITRE and the Council have agreed on the climate law. So I think it's something on which I think as European citizens we should be proud of. And indeed, the economic and the social transformation that is brought necessarily together with the decarbonization of our economy are not contradictory terms. We know that the European economy since the 90s has reduced its emissions by 25%. At the same time, the economy has grown by 60%. I know these are dry figures, but this shows that something can be done. We have already shown that with ETS, which is at the core, as you know, is one of the core instruments of our climate policy. There we have had quite good energy efficiency gains. This has been given impetus to deploy new technologies. We have, because it's true that we need to make sure to be mindful of the competitiveness issues, and we have been, the system has foreseen free allocations for a number of sectors which are exactly in the danger of being, of having what is called in this, the carbon leakage. This regulation will come back afterwards, but there is all this transformation needs as well money. Absolutely, we need to, and we are in a moment where it is a very, very special moment where we have this awful pandemic with us, but at the same time, member states of the parliament have agreed to put on the table a huge amount of resources in not only the just transition mechanism, which is more embedded in the climate policy, but overall the recovery and resilience facility, which are unique opportunities to do this socially fair transformation and business that makes sense in terms of business.
Thank you.
And we've seen, can I just give you a last message, because we are in the less in this is not seen only within Europe. It's we have the competition of the rest of the world, as we were said, and we know that already China, South Korea, Japan are making similar announcements. So we are all moving hopefully together, or more together.
Thank you very much, Clara. I'll come back on the future challenges. That's what we've done and where we are. Come on to the future challenges in a moment. But Christian Silva-Busoy, very good to see you, sir. And I'm delighted that Wendell has now joined us as well. Good to see you, Wendell. I'll come to you in just a moment. But from your perspective, do you, Clara was saying there very much, the two things are not contradictory. The economic, the social, the environmental, all of these things can work together. Do you agree with that? And do you think we are getting the balance right in terms of addressing all these issues together in a holistic way?
I agree with the principle. I agree with the concept. I agree that we should do like this to see the industry policies and strategies and environmental goals not subservient one to another, but working in synergy, and try to find and to see what are the opportunities of our big effort that we are doing in order to achieve Green Deal objectives. It is, of course, not easy for some industries. It could be a burden, but we should find solutions in order to, as it was said before, to build a market for the green steel, to give the right incentives, to invest money in research and innovation, public money from Horizon Europe. Or I was working to a tiny program, but it could be also very much relevant, is the Research Fund for Coal and Steel. As a ITRE chair, I was also the rapporteur, and we'll vote in the plenary soon the report on this. Of course, it is only around 40 million every year, but these are destined to help universities, research centers, and private companies to fund projects in this area, because we need innovation in order to achieve our goals. We do not forget that European industry is a global leader in many sectors. It accounts over half of Europe's exports, provides directly or indirectly, of course, with over 20% of the jobs in Europe. So we should take into account and take care of European industry. Already, European steel industry and its value chain have been under extreme difficulties for years, for a long time. And we should not put additional burden without going also to give incentives and help in order to not to lose jobs, not to lose competitivity. Europe's competitors are investing heavily in the upgrade of their industry. The productivity gap with some countries is increasing, and major economic players like China are competing with those industrial sectors where EU was leading for several decades. So maybe one answer will be research, innovation, to be very innovative, and also, of course, to find those policy incentives to protect. The carbon adjustment mechanism could be one of it.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to come back on those policy incentives, as you say, both to protect but also to create that market for green steel. I'll be interested to get a viewpoint on that in a moment. But Wendell, complete the picture for us in terms of the challenge that we face if we are to address all of these issues together and make sure that companies, that workforces in this very important sector for decarbonisation can play their full part in this, that we make it an economic success, a social success, as well as absolutely crucially on the day of the climate law, as Clara was pointing out, the environmental success it needs to be.
Yes, thank you, Jackie, and thanks for inviting me to this panel. So maybe I can start with a bit of a different perspective, in the sense that for us as NGOs, climate change policy is obviously not just about environmental policy. It is actually also about social policy and economic policy, because it is very clear that if we do nothing, if we don't tackle the climate change challenge, that we're actually going to face serious impacts on our economy and on lives of people. And we already see that happening now. According to the numbers from the Joint Research Center, we're facing around 12 billion euros of economic impacts of climate change every year already today. And this might be substantially increased up to about 250 billion euros a year if we're not tackling climate change in a substantial way. So it is not that we're now speaking about climate change policy as an environmental policy versus economic and social policy. Actually, climate change policy is a social policy, is an economic policy. And if we are not able to merge all of our concerns together, we will face difficulties anyhow, and our industry will face difficulties anyhow. So that's crucial that we start from the beginning, that we need kind of a comprehensive approach where all of the elements are together. And yes, there is still some work to be done, because it's not always happening, and there might be elements of climate policy where the social dimension has not been fully integrated, but that needs to happen. We need to make sure that the transition is a just transition, that it takes into account the impacts on communities, that it takes into account the impacts on workers, and that it takes into account the impact on our businesses. But obviously, our businesses will not remain the same, but that again is irrespective of climate change and climate change policies. Our economy, our industry is changing. We are in a global market, and that global market makes some changes to our domestic market in the EU. So the change will happen, and the question is, can we ensure that it is a regulated change that takes into account all the different elements that need to happen?
Thank you. And in terms, Clara, of the challenge we face to do that, how do you see the way ahead? Where are we going to need to focus? And we've heard that emphasis on a range of issues, the competitiveness issue, which you yourself mentioned at the beginning, and Christian Silvio Busso was talking about this market. How do we create the market for green steel? Where do you see the key challenges? Are they more policy related? Are they financing related? Where do we need to focus, do you think?
I think we need to focus. We need to do all of them at the same time. They are all part of the policy mix. Very much agree with previous speakers on the need on investing in innovation and transformation. And so we have, for example, under Horizon Europe, in the framework program, we put together a partnership, public-private partnership on clean steel, precisely because we know how much the sector is suffering, how much the sector is important for our economy. We will be revising, and I'm sure in the next panel will be discussed. So I will stop there on industrial policy, a new industrial policy. We have to use our social fund as well. We have to make sure that we are competing with the rest of the world in terms of added value, in terms of innovation, and not in terms of wages or cost of energy. Business tells us very often, and they are right in saying that they need a stable and clear legislative framework. And this is why we are working like mad, I can assure you, like mad, in preparing the whole package, so-called Fit for 55%. And we will be seeing in June the proposals on ETS, the proposals on ECF, on effort sharing, on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is very important as well, as you have mentioned. So I think this is where we have, in this moment, putting our efforts and a call to member states and business to seize the opportunity of the huge amount of resources that you can find in the recovery fund.
Thank you. Before I come back to Axel and Judith on this, Christian, I just wanted to ask you, Axel said at the beginning, he said this decarbonisation is being driven by regulation, and so it's legislators who need to support the creation of those markets for green steel. How do you see the challenge there? And you mentioned incentives earlier. What sort of incentives do you think will be most effective to address that?
This is something that we have to discuss, of course, and the first input should come from the industry, because they know better what is feasible, what is not feasible, and how we could together in a partnership create these incentives. I know that EU steel industry already had some commitments. They committed to reduce the CO2 emissions in 10 years by 2030 by 30%. Compared to 2018, which is more or less 55%, the magic number, compared to 1990. This is extremely important. I know that the steel industry is very much concentrated in a limited number of installations. So if we concentrate in upgrading, in giving incentives, in investing in new technology, helping to invest in new technology, this will have an immediate impact, and is quite advanced among the energy intensive industries in terms of CO2 low project. And during my previous contacts and inputs that I received from the industry, I saw good examples of already projects in order to reduce CO2 emissions or to produce with CO2 low emissions. So it's clearly that there are technical solutions. It is clear that some of the solutions are already in practice. What we could do is to invest money in research and innovation from Horizon Europe, from the fund that I just mentioned earlier. I'm not sure if this carbon adjustment border tax will protect a little bit, will help the industry in order to remain competitive, because the most problematic is the competition with industries and countries which do not do any effort and which will continue to use high CO2 emissions technologies in order to produce their products. So here we could discuss and could be a very feasible solution. And of course, even in public tenders, to reward in some way what is produced with low CO2 emissions, what will be green steel. But we should be open for concrete proposals from the industry, because they know better, and see how we could incorporate these proposals in the future legislation that will come in the next years.
Thank you. And Wendell, in this sector and in others, what do you believe in terms of creating those markets that are needed for green products? What for you is the key? And then I'll come back to Axel and Judith.
Yeah, well, it's clear that regulation is a key part. As already said, with the approval of the climate law, we now have clear legislation that says that EU needs to go climate neutral, but even beyond needs to go after that net negative. And this really means that all sectors of our economy will need to go to net zero or close to, will need to go to zero or close to zero emissions. And that also goes for the steel sector. And I think it's very important that the political leadership of the EU now ensures that all of the legislation that will be developed will really be with that long-term goal, and that we don't move away from that trajectory and are very clear that that is where we need to go. And next to the legislation, I think it's extremely important that we also support really the alternatives, both in terms of the alternatives of how we can phase out the use of fossil fuel in the steel sector, the alternatives in terms of promoting circularity in the steel sector, and looking at how and what kind of lessons we can learn from things like the taxonomy, etc., to steer investments in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Axel, Christian said, we want the first input to come from industry. So in terms of creating those markets, a thought from you on that, and also let me weave together the two issues, because also the issue of financing, because we have a question from the audience saying research may be good for green steel, but most of the technologies are already known. The investments are really high for these technology, especially for an industry that struggles to get positive results. Should it be better to help the steel industries with green steel funding for investments in green technologies? So question really, what do you see as the key levers to drive that market for green products? And in terms of financing, where do you need the money most, public money most?
First, to answer the question, of course, we have already part of the technologies available, but they have never been tested with the application of a huge amount of hydrogen, for example. And therefore, we need support for the scaling up of these technologies, which can then use hydrogen. Maybe we need a transition where we need also natural gas. We have, of course, other technology options such as carbon capture and use and storage. All these options, and we are now talking, and we will soon publish this, about more than 80 promising projects. Just half a year ago, we spoke about around about 30 to 40. Now we have 80 which are known to us, and these need to be financed. And of course, that need to be public finance, but also private finance. We have the Commission on the finance side with very positive initiatives. We will have a clean steel partnership with a budget of probably above 1 billion euros for R&D, but we have also the recovery fund, which is be discussed now on national level. We have an innovation fund, so the tools for the financing are there. What we are a little bit missing is when we talk about sustainable finance, that there are regulations, but that does not secure that the financial institutions will be more open to finance more risky projects. So we need to talk about that as well, because it is risky if you invest in green steel, which is more expensive than a conventional steel being imported. So what we need in terms of further support is hydrogen, for example, is more costly than coking coal. That needs, therefore, for a certain transition to be co-financed in order to create a market for green steel. And once we have a market for green steel developing, then of course any kind of aid can also be reduced.
Thank you very much, Judith. In your Steel Action Plan that you published last June, there was also a very strong focus on investment in decarbonisation, investment in skills. We'll come back to the skills issue, I hope, in our second panel today. But for you, where can public money really make the difference? Where do you want to see the focus? And in terms of the other incentives we've talked about, a reaction on what's been said, if you would. Judith. We seem to have a freeze with Judith for the moment. I will come back to her in a moment, but I wanted, yes, Axel, I want to come to something else, and I'll come back to Judith in a moment, but I just wanted to come back on the point of, you talked earlier about a Green Deal for steel. Eurofair has called for a Green Deal for steel. You've said there is the German steel action concept. You've said we need something specific for this sector. We can't take just an ecosystem, broad industrial approach. Steel needs its own plan. Industrial also launched calls for a steel action plan. Very briefly, and then I'd like to get the panel's reaction. Why is it so important to have something sector specific from your point of view?
Because, of course, the whole issue is extremely complex, and the European steel industry is one of the highest at-risk sectors because of global competition. We have established an action plan, 10 points, which need to be tackled. And we have communicated that to the European institutions. IndustriAll has done a similar exercise, and now we are waiting to have a kind of steel action plan together with the policymakers. Of course, when we are talking about sectoral plans or roadmaps, which, by the way, is a request by the European Parliament as well, then this does not mean that this is only on one sector, only on the steel industry. The impact is on the whole value chain. If we start to use hydrogen in the steel industry, we will need huge amounts, and that will support entire regions, because if one steel plant requires hydrogen, you can connect the municipalities, the SMEs, the highways, and by that support many other sectors in the value chain. And I believe we agree with other sectors who also are asking for more sector individual approaches within an ecosystem approach.
Thank you. Judith, welcome back. I know you were having some sound issues.
Yeah, sorry for that.
I can hear you beautifully now. Judith, I was asking you when we lost you two things. Your steel action plan, very much focused on investment in decarbonisation, investment in skills. As I say, I'd like to come back to the skills issue later on. But where do you think public money most needs to be put? And the second question, which I just asked Axel to pick up on because you weren't here, you've called for, you've had your own steel action plan published last June, and you've called very much for a sector-specific approach here. Axel was explaining from his perspective why he thinks that's important. Also from yours, briefly if you would, so I can then get a reaction from the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I apologise. This is the nightmare of online meetings. But I guess from our perspective, it is about investment. I mean, the scale and the pace of the transformation that we have to undertake in effectively one investment cycle for our industry is so considerable that we need to have a framework of adequate investment. And I think what was interesting from the first call in the investment fund linked to the ETS last year was that for that small, relatively big, but still small pot of money, 1.8 billion euros of the innovation fund, we had industry proposals of over 20 billion funds. So there is appetite in terms of proposals on the table, but it's that investment, in our view, has to come with strings attached. This isn't money just for industry. It has to have strings attached in terms of employment and production capacity in Europe, to ensure that there is really a benefit for European taxpayers of investing in the transformation of the industry. We have, some quite considerable concerns about what's going on in certain big groups in the steel industry at the moment, and corporate strategies which are being pursued. So if we're investing public money, which we recognise that has to be part of the deal, then that has to be done in a responsible way with responsibility from the steel companies on the other side. But money isn't the only issue. And I just very quickly, Jackie, this is about a policy jigsaw. We have to get the policy jigsaw right. Next week, we need to have an assertive and proactive, renewed, updated European industrial strategy, which actually sets out an industrial policy, a clean industrial policy strategy to accompany the sectoral roadmaps to 2050. We need an ecosystems approach for industrial policy, but we need that matrix of, on the one hand, the ecosystems in which our industries sit in, but sectoral granularity to understand what it means in terms of decarbonisation in sites across Europe, and then a regional approach to tackle the regional dimension. So it's the matrix and the policy coherence.
Thank you. Christian, this point, and there is much debate about the ecosystem approach Judith was talking about. We need both, but we do need, and they have called for specific action in this area, and citing this example of the German example, where they developed a concept specifically for this industry. And Eurofair saying, look, this is a good example. We just need to take this up to the European level. What is your view on that, Christian?
I think that it is a need for a Green Deal for steel. It is not too much to ask, because it's clearly a sector which has a very important impact, 2.6 million jobs, and also have some specificities. Part of the 10-point proposals that were made by Eurofer, of course, if they will be applied, could be applied also for other industries or other sectors, and have a more general impact. There are other measures which are very much targeted to this industry, and I believe that it should be taken into account. I don't think that there is much opposition inside European Parliament, inside the Industry, Research and Energy Committee on many of those proposals. Of course, it should be discussed, but I don't see proposals which are not okay. It is clear that we have the same goal. This goal is very much supported, and already important steps are made by different industries, including the steel industry. This is a clear direction, but of course we have to ensure the transition. I very much agree that we don't have yet a market for hydrogen. It is difficult. We still need gas for a period, not only for this and for other industries also, and even for the energy mix. So there are issues that should be discussed during the transition, and there are measures that should be implemented for the steel industry. So I totally support the idea to have a very much personalized transition for the steel industry. Important is to start to work on concrete measures. Some of the measures are quite general. We are discussing about the recovery facility. I'm not sure if Eurofer made an assessment in how many European member states they incorporated steel industry projects. In Romania, I'm not very sure, or at least with a big impact, because of course, if you want to digitalize a factory, and could be also a steel factory, it's not a problem, but the big impact is not there.
Thank you very much, Christian. Clara, a thought to this question of the ecosystem approach versus the sector specific, and then to Wendell, the same question, but also Wendell, how we make sure that you talked at the beginning about how all these things go together, how we make sure we have true alignment between the policies. But Clara first, we need an action plan for steel. Everybody agreeing so far? Yes, we do.
I'm sure you will understand that I will not give you a yes or no reply, because this is a difficult one. I mean, I see the point, and as our member of parliament was saying, I mean, I think we can all share very much of the actions that are being proposed. And we should not forget that the Green Deal is not only about climate policy; it's about the whole economic and industrial policy. So it's from that perspective we have to shape things. In the specific climate policy, we are not. I would not say we are taking a sector approach, but as you know very well, not all sectors are addressed with all the different measures, whether legislative or not. So we are mindful of the differences that exist in the different sectors. Which ones are more open, more subject to competition, which ones are not. The need, as both you and Axel have mentioned very well, the need to deploy a certain number of technologies, and we funding there with the Innovation Fund. And I acknowledge the difficulties with the other financial sector, and we are working there as much as we can with the taxonomy, which I know it's not perfect, but it's a step forward. And with the European Investment Bank, will declare itself a climate bank. So I don't know, Kerstin Jorna probably has clearer views, but we agree that the sector is very important, and this is why we are focusing a number of actions on that sector. That's for sure.
Thank you. And we'll hear from Kerstin in our next section. And I know she's listening already to this discussion, so I will put that to her in a moment. But Wendell, your view on the sector specific versus the ecosystem, and how we genuinely ensure that all these policies, new revised industrial policy, social policies, we haven't mentioned it yet, but we have the social summit coming up in May in Porto, focusing on the pillar of social rights action plan. How do you see bringing all these policies together so that this jigsaw that Judith described really does, the pieces really do fit together?
Yes, thank you. So, Yes, we do support both an ecosystem approach and specific sectoral action. It's very clear that, again, if we are going to achieve climate neutrality and go beyond, we will need everybody on board. We will need our industrial sector to be on board, and we will need to look at very specific actions that we need to take for the steel sector and for other industrial sectors, because there are specific actions that will be needed for specific industries. But that all should happen within a broader framework, and that broader framework needs to be very clear, and that is that broader framework also where we need to look at the coherence with other policies. For me, this is what is enshrined in the concept of the European Green Deal. For me, the concept of the European Green Deal is really bringing all of that together. Our current assessment would be that that is not yet fully happening. Common agriculture policy, for instance, as one of those examples, where we see that the mainstreaming of the climate neutrality objective and what happens in specific sectors is not yet there. I think similarly, the gap between social policies and climate policies also needs further bridging, but I see that as one of the elements that the top level in the Commission, being the first Vice President Timmermans, as well as the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, it's their task to bring kind of that coherence and bring everything.
So it's happening in some areas, not in others. I'm going to come back, Judith, on the social pillar a bit later on, and I'm going to ask you, and I'm not going to ask you and Axel this final question for now. I'll ask it to you at the end of our second panel because you're staying with me. But to Christian, to Clara and to Wendell, I know you said, Clara, at the beginning, we need to do all of these things. And Judith made clear it's a policy jigsaw, so there are a number of elements. But if you had to identify a key next step to ensure, and I want to go back to the title of our event, that we really do build this economic and social framework that delivers the successful climate transition that today, as you pointed out, we have recommitted to with that deal between Parliament and Council. What for you is instead of saying one priority, because I accept that isn't, a key next step? What do we need to do next? Same question to all three of you, 1 minute each if you would. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you. The key next step is getting our proposals ready for the 55% objective and getting agreement, interinstitutional agreement, as quickly as possible so that we have the clear framework and quickly the good signals to investment and growth.
Thank you very much. Christian.
I believe that we should start to go a little bit more in depth to the 10-point Green Deal for Steel plan. It is important to already think to some concrete measures, concrete modifications of the legislation. It is not a silver bullet or just a single measure that will save the industry, that will help to become more competitive. It's a mix of factors, of investments, of incentives, of help, of protection in a way that it should be fair at the international competition. So it's a comprehensive plan, and we have to go from the principles and from the general view to very concrete measures that should be implemented in a feasible calendar.
Thank you very much. Wendell, last word.
Yeah, very difficult question, but I would say that the key next step would be to kind of bring all the different policies together that would need to help in addressing this challenge of going to climate neutrality in a way that is socially, environmentally, etc., just and fair. And I think already having that knowledge, it's not just about the elements of the Fit for 55 package. There's also other policies that are important, both environmental policies, circularity, social policies, etc. And bring all of that together would already be an important next step.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you so much, Wendell, Christian, Clara, for a great discussion. I wish we had longer, but thank you for today and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you so much. Axel, Judith, stay with me, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you. I'm sorry, lots of very detailed questions coming in, and we don't have time to drill down into the detail today, but if you do have any, if you can try and keep them fairly broad, that would help. And also, please use the Q&A box. I see some are coming in the chat box. Please, if you could use the Q&A box for that. So we now move to our second panel, and joining Axel, Judith, and me to discuss towards a low carbon, high skill, just transition, what framework for success in the industry, I am delighted to welcome Kerstin Jona, Director General in the European Commission's Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs, better known to all of us as DG GROW, Just Korte, Director General in the Commission's Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, EMPL, to you and I, and Gabrielle Bischoff, MEP, Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee and a member of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee. Gabrielle, if you can hear me, if you could activate your camera as well, that would be great so we can see you. Let us get underway while hopefully Gabrielle sorts out his small technical issues. In terms of the issues we need to address, I know you were listening there to the end of that discussion, Kerstin. Perhaps I could come to you first. In terms of if we are to ensure that this transition is genuinely just, sociably equitable and fair, but also put it in that context of joined up thinking between our industrial policy, social policy, climate policy. What do you think are the key challenges we need to address?
Thank you very much, Jackie, and good morning, everybody. I see three blocks of issues, let's put it that way. First of all, the depth and the scope of the transition. And here I want to say it's not only an industry transition, it's a transition that concerns all of us. It's a societal transition. It's how we work, how we live, how we move, how we learn. It's all. It's, you know, we work from home. That's part of this transition. We book our holidays online. That's part of this transition. We have solar panels on our roofs. That's part of the transition. We have, you know, the tractor tells the farmer where to put the fertilizer. That's part of the transition. And we can only apprehend this if we see it as a full. It's not only my work, it's the broader picture. The second block I'd like to make is that the transition is always both. It has, you know, it's like a Dr. Jekyll and Hyde. It has opportunities for some, and it's a risk to others. And we need to be really to communicate about it. The green and digital transition in the construction sector may mean 160,000 jobs and plus new jobs. In the fossil fuel industry, it may mean a lot of jobs lost. So we need not only to speak of risk, not only of opportunities, we have to develop, and I'm very thankful for this event today, because it will help us to develop this kind of broader narrative around this. My third block is, it's not about the if, you know, we're not going to stop this transition. It's about the how we manage it. And that takes me, for example, to the aspect of skills. And I'm sure Jos will also talk about it. But according to recent studies, 100 million people will need to up or re-skill. That means also new jobs. That's great, but possibly not in the same region. If we look at our 500 production sites for steel, where are they? They are where coal is, because that was the major input that you needed to produce steel. Tomorrow, it's not going to be about coal. It's about being about hydrogen, and hydrogen in itself is about being renewable. So it will be steel and the sun, steel and the wind. We have a quite amazing, and for me very emblematic, industrial project in the north of Sweden, where wind creates hydrogen, where hydrogen creates a new type of steel factory, and where that steel goes into a car factory, because cars, as a kind of steel user sector, they also have to decarbonize. So green steel into a car, 1 ton of steel per car. That's the new industrial geography we have to look at. Another example, okay, so the last point I want to make is what can the EU do? Transition pathways for the ecosystems, you know, think together how we will manage, how, not the if, how we will manage that transition, which goes from raw materials to technology to skills, which looks also at markets for these new products, you know, the green steel for cars, and we have to do it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots to come back to in our discussion. And Gabrielle, it's great to see you, and apologies. I gather it was at our end the camera was causing a problem. It's lovely to have you with us. But Joost, if I could just ask you to complete the picture from the other side of this equation, and talking there about this societal transition. And we're talking a lot about a transition that is socially equitable and fair. What for you are the key challenges now for this sector to make sure we can achieve that?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's very enjoyable and extremely interesting topics. And I think it's good that we also look at the specificities of a sector where everybody recognizes that it will be impacted, is already impacted. And I'm very grateful for this, for the organization to bring this forward. I mean, I think the starting point is a bit like what Kerstin said. The starting point is, of course, that all the calculations that we have done show that, in fact, the Green Deal will be beneficial for jobs. In 2030, in 2050, you will have seen the calculations, 1.2 up to 2 million jobs extra. Kerstin mentioned the renovation wave, 160,000 jobs extra. So I think the overall picture isn't all that gloomy. However, we also have to be realistic. We're not in 2030 and we're not even in 2050. So what's going to happen meanwhile? And also, I think it's fair to say that the transition, which we will do, is not automatically going to be just. It will not happen by itself. So what we need is strong government policies coming from the member states and from the European Union. But it would be a mistake, of course, to think that we have another option, because the calculations also show that business as usual will really lead to immediate losses in GDP between -2% and -4%, and make it also impossible to live and work in large parts of the European Union. So I think we have no other choice than to do this. And if you then look at where the real issues will be, beyond sort of the macro figures, which are again quite positive. I already said we're not in 2030. So what are we going to do the next 9 years? We're not in 2050. What are we going to do the next 30 years before we reach this possible paradise? Secondly, most importantly, there are, of course, vast regional disparities. I mean, the macro figures of Europe are not very informative. We have to go a lot deeper, and which is actually what the Just Transition Fund is doing. Then also sectors, of course. I mean, the sector that we're discussing today, but other energy-intensive sectors. The distributional impact of measures on people's incomes is a very important chantier that we're working on very actively now. Because I think at the end of the day, my feeling is, and I think this is also borne out by serious research, is that the people of Europe, the citizens of Europe, are really prepared to make the effort. They are convinced, but it has to be done in a fair way. And we have seen already in the past, I don't have to mention the yellow vests, that this is not a given. So strong government policies. You mentioned, I was very happy to listen to you, Jackie, the Porto Summit, the action plan to implement the pillar of social rights, which is in a way the compass, which is principles that I think everybody of us adheres to. And I've never met anybody who contests the need for a social transition. But once you go into the details of what this actually means, there will be a number of very stark political, difficult choices to be made.
Thank you very much. Lots to come back to. Gabrielle, a very warm welcome to you. So, you're saying there it won't be an automatically just transition. Strong government will be needed. We need to make it just. It can be beneficial, as you said, but we need to make it just. And it's this question of how we get from here to those great new job opportunities and so on. What is your perspective on the challenge ahead and how well equipped we are with the current policy tools at our disposal to make it happen?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward very much to the exchange, especially to look at it from the perspective of one sector, because I think, and Joost Korte mentioned this, we have a debate going on general level, but it's also to look at certain sectors and certain value chains to see. But I think the first and important step is to accept the scale of the required transformation, because we have different transformations. we have the digital and the green transitions to address, and we have to shape these transitions. We cannot just let it happen and hope that it will all be just as it was mentioned before, but because we need the people to embark on these transitions, and they want to know what is the strategy to make these transitions work for the many, not only the few, and how we enable the people, how we empower them, so that they have also some security, some trust that they will not be left behind, and that it will not just be nice words, but really concepts, programs happening to make sure that we manage these transitions well. And I think it was, the social pillar was already mentioned. We pushed also, I'm coming from the progressive family, very much really to place social Europe also at the heart of the recovery. And this will be, I think, the big test, and there to see how do we create quality jobs, what concepts and also roadmaps do we have for reskilling and upskilling for workers, fair salaries, working conditions. And I think we have one experience in Europe is that here also it's very important to see the role of workers' voice, because what we can see where we have functioning social dialogue, that these processes of transition are managed much better. We have more investment there. We have better working conditions. And I think this is also an aspect that will be very important.
Thank you.
But let me emphasize one more point. Also, I started with the scale of the transitions, that we don't only look at Europe, but also at the external dimension of the green transition in Europe, and that we see, I mean, if you look at the whole value chain, you also have to see we cannot do it at the expenses of exploiting the global south. If you look at the extraction of raw materials, etc., I think at the same time we also need an approach to look at the whole supply chain and to make sure that good working conditions are really an integrated approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to bring in a moment Judith and Axel in, but Kirsten, if I could come back to something which came up in our first panel, and I'm very keen to get your view. You talked about looking at the I can never say this word, specificities of particular sectors, and Gabriela also talking about we need to look at these different perspectives. This debate, Eurofair have called and Industrial have called for a specific action plan for steel. They've both come forward with proposals and also talked about this German model. They have one and suggest we should do it at the European level. What is your answer to that discussion? Do we need, you talked about transition pathways for ecosystems, but would you agree we need both?
I totally agree we need both. But what we need in particular, and I like very much Ms. Bischoff, what you said, is to do it together. Because we need to work together, and we need, it's not I and I are they and they, it's we. That's what we have to build. And that's why social partners are so important. And, you know, steel, I just made the example, steel is a super important sector because it's at the basis of many other sectors and ecosystems and the car. So we cannot have a discussion about the mobility ecosystem pathway, how to do the transition, without talking about steel. We cannot have a discussion in any ecosystem without talking about renewable energy, because that's at the heart of it. So that means the energy intensive industries. It's we need to build the bridges between it, and the more we put it into little boxes, the less effective we will be.
Thank you.
And that's the idea of the pathways.
Thank you. Judith, just to come back on this question, Transition will not be automatically just, said just a little earlier. And you, in your social action plan, have talked about the different elements of what we need. Could you just elaborate a little bit on what you think is most important? And in the interest of saving time, because we don't have long, on the pillar of social rights, the action plan, you welcomed it as a step in the right direction, but you also said you were disappointed. You thought we needed stronger instruments. What do you think needs to happen to make sure it actually delivers on what it says it is there to do? Both questions.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and be very, very brief. And I guess the starting point is that it's not unusual from a trade union organisation that we welcome something, but we say that it's not strong enough and we would like more. That is that's not an extraordinary position that we take, but what I think is important is Gabby's point about the scale of the transition and the speed of the transition, which we're about to, and we're part of already, and we're undertaking, and therefore I think the crucial part of to ensure justice in the transition is to ensure active participation of those affected by the transition. We have, I'm not going to redefine just transition here. We spent many years in the ILO negotiating global guidelines on what just transition is. And those global guidelines put right at the heart social dialogue, worker voice, information and consultation, and the process of anticipating and managing change. And we have some of the key instruments at European level already in terms of those employment law instruments and industrial relations. But what we're seeing is not just a regional disparity in terms of the decarbonisation that Just was talking about. We're seeing a regional disparity in terms of how those instruments are applied. If I contrast the industrial relations that exist around the Swedish green steel projects, which are world leading, and we celebrate them as much as we can. We think they're fantastic, and the trade unions are tightly embedded in developing that strategy in Sweden for the steel industry. If I contrast that to what's happening in Slovakia at the moment, where collective bargaining has effectively been dismantled above the company level, then how can we guarantee a just transition when we don't have the structures to actually be able to negotiate the justice part of the transition? So we need at European level, not just a stronger European industrial policy coordination. I can see there's a question in the questions about how do we ensure coherence in a European industrial policy. We need that also within the just transition framework. It should be mandatory in order to have access to European funds that there has been proper involvement of the trade unions locally and proper social dialogue in terms of planning. This is in the Just Transition Fund regulation, but what we see on the ground is it's not being properly applied. So we need to ensure that we have that just transition framework really implemented on the ground across Europe. And obviously, you know, just to reiterate, it's not just about those who are the losers. As we heard, just transition is also about those who are the winners in this transition. It's about creating new jobs. It's about sustainable industrial policies. It's about giving a future for regions and ensuring that there is regional economic development right across Europe. So yeah, we are very key. We're really delighted to see the action plan of the European Pillar of Social Rights. We're looking forward to the Porto Summit, but we need to ensure that this really delivers on the ground right across Europe in every member state.
Thank you very much. Axel, if I could come to slightly pick up on that point, if you would, about social dialogue, because today, this joint event is an example of that sort of conversation happening. And I know that you and Industrial work closely together. You wrote a joint letter to the Environment Council back in December about what you wanted to see. So clearly you think it's important. What more do you think we need to do in that area, if anything? And can I also just ask, putting the just transition challenge also in the context of the challenges your industry is already facing? You talked at the beginning about the job losses, you talked about the overcapacity problems, capacity reduction, and so on. We've heard about the impact on regions and that link between steel regions and coal regions. For you, how do we make sure that all these transitions are managed together?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. First of all, the social dialogue with the unions is very important and successful. And I believe we all made a proposal, and that's the Steel Action Plan. And there you can further discuss these issues. And we only need the policymakers to join now, and then we can maybe move forward that issue. I believe we must leave anyone behind. The transition has to be done in particular on the existing sites. We will not see, and it's not recommendable to build a lot of new greenfield sites in Europe. It's already a challenge for the permits alone. So you can also not move entire ecosystems from Romania to the North Sea because the wind is blowing more. So that's not possible. There's a whole infrastructure. It's not only the steel industry, it's connected to SMEs, it's connected to car manufacturers in the regions. So we have to do that transition in the regions. And for many regions, we have basic infrastructures in place to transport, for example, renewable electricity and hydrogen. Of course, that has to be expanded, and that will also create the jobs. When we are talking about 500 sites, production sites in Europe, it's not mainly there where coal was produced before. We have 22 integrated sites based on coking coal left in Europe. Most of the other sites are electric arc furnace sites. They are where scrap is available, and that's everywhere, basically. We have also not the traditional blast furnaces only where coal is, but also where the infrastructures are favorable, near to the sea, for example. We need to put the emphasis. Do that if you want to have a just transition. Do that mainly in the existing sites where we have the skilled workers, and you will not see them moving from one country to the other.
Indeed not. And an interesting comment, half question from Jaap-Jan Aardenburg in the audience: how to overcome individual EU country interests and adopt a real joint EU approach, also regarding overcapacities. This, he says, will be a key success factor. So very much that. Let me come, we don't have long, and I want to come to the issue of skills. And just perhaps I could start with you now in terms of the skills challenge, the upskilling and the reskilling. Industrial have called, as part of their Steel Action Plan, underline the importance of both sustained public and private investments in skilling. How do you think, I mean, this is an issue, I've been moderating debates about the European skills agenda for many years, and we come back to this again and again. Do you think we're on the right track now? And in terms of the investment needed in this, how do you see the way forward?
I think we're on the right track, but we come from very, very far. And when I say we, I mean not so much the European Commission, it's much more Europe as a whole. Because if we look at the figures, which you will also have seen many times before, Jackie, I don't think it requires a Nobel Prize winner to see where the problems are. We do have a real skills deficit in Europe. The figures are not good. And that's also why in the action plan, we fix a target of 60% of adults to do a training at least once a year. Today, the percentage is below 35%. So 60% should do at least a training once a year. And that's a target which we hope that will be endorsed in Porto. And would then set, I think, a very ambitious target. But it's just because it's really important. Not only skills as such, and here I think it's again linked to many other issues. It's linked also to the moves that will be required from people from one job to another. I mean, there will always be work, but the work will change. So even if you have a job, you need to constantly be ready to upskill and reskill. And I think the workers need to be helped. And the employers also need to be helped. And that's why I think at the level of the European Union, we do our best. There's a lot of funding available, unprecedented levels of funding now under this multi-annual financial framework, plus Next Generation EU. But also we come forward with a number of concrete proposals, such as an individual learning account. There will be another discussion about the right to be trained. And I think that the worker should have a right to be trained as a principle. But of course, if you're managing a small, medium enterprise, you maybe have only 5 or 10 staff. It's easy to have a right to be trained, but how do you organize this? I think it's really difficult. Bigger firms tend to do a lot better. They have their own schools even sometimes. So I think the effort needs to be put also on the others who are in the ecosystem. I mean, I should indeed, I can also recommend actually the activities done in the steel sector, because there's the blueprint that is already active, which is, I think, quite successful, where I think there is a cooperation between labor, workers, and universities and schools to also look at where the skills of the future will be. How can you organize this? So I think we're on the right track, but we have a long way to go.
Gabrielle, would you share that analysis of where we are, and what do you think needs to be done if we are to travel that long way that we have to go?
I see it as an opportunity, because the promise we have of a more social Europe and the promise of the social pillar itself, I think if you look at it, what you can see is the pillar is repeating a lot of rights that already existed, but it has new elements. And one of the new elements of the pillar agreed in Göteborg is this right to training and lifelong learning. And I think here the approach with the 60% is an important step, because indeed the scale and the speed, we have to speed up here, and we need policies to support it. But I would also like to highlight an important element, and that is the equal access of all workers to this. Because what we can see, indeed, Joost Korte said, bigger companies have more elaborated concepts here and strategies. But also there we can see that the higher your qualification is, the higher is your chance to get further training. And if you analyze who is participating in training, there is a big divide. I think we have to approach this. And another one that we discussed many years ago, it was a bit forgotten, is this urgent need for anticipation of change. And here also regarding training. And I mean, I want to refer to Günther Schmidt and others for years that say it will be important not to wait until people are getting laid off or unemployed, but to start new schemes, for example, where people would, in anticipation of the change coming, continue, for example, to work part-time, and the other part, they would be trained for new jobs and would get this upskilling. And for this, we need totally new approaches here, and not to wait too long here. And I think this will be very important, as I said in the beginning, to give people the courage to embark on this transition and to see that it can deliver for them, because it will not be the words that will encourage them, but the actions here. So it is an opportunity, but we are losing time indeed, and we need to do this quite fast and see how we can link the initiatives we have on European level. We seem to address it from different silos. You have the recovery plan, you have the just transition, you have the upskilling, but we need more coherent approaches here.
Absolutely, and interesting, because there is a question from the audience about how much money of the recovery funds will go just to the steel industry, and I'm wondering within that whether the recovery funds will have a focus on this skills, upskilling, reskilling question. Kirsten, your perspective on the challenge ahead, and perhaps also how you see the role. As I mentioned earlier, Industrial have called for sustained and more public and private investment. Where do you think the public purse can help most? And then I'll come back to Judith and Axel for a thought on this before we draw some conclusions. Kirsten, you're muted at the moment. Sorry, the eternal words of the COVID era.
Sorry. First of all, I want to say to Axel, I did not suggest that all the steel producers have to move, to sun and wind. What we have to manage is that the energy, renewable energy, gets to these sites, and that will require, where do you produce it? How do you transport it? How do you store it? That's the key of what we have in the Hydrogen Alliance. On the investment, the investors want certainty. So where I see the role for all of us is to give the certainty of where the travel goes, and that we have good mappings also what we need. And that's, again, the transition pathways. What does it take to manage that decarbonization and transition? And it's true, there are the targets, but that's not all. We need to think about raw materials. Where do they come from? Do we have enough? If we need more renewable energy, we need magnets. Where do they come from? Do we have enough? Maybe we can produce them in Europe. There's the technology. In the steel sector, some of the technologies are now available, but some, they still need a little push to be developed. Here, maybe our research work can help. Then we need the skills. I mean, just to give a number, we think it's about 5,000 to 10,000 euro per person to be upskilled. Now we need to think about where that money comes from and how that is invested. Where then there is as I said, we need enough renewable energy to be where we need it, and all of this requires public and private financing. I think in the first panel you already addressed the taxonomy. This is a powerful tool to actually attract private investment, and if on the transition pathways we manage to give to show investors how this will be a business case, all the investment we are doing, how that will be a good business case for the ecosystem in question, for the steel sector, then the money will also come. I'm quite confident. And I see the role of Europe in this really as being the convening hub, bringing these different aspects together, showing that, here's work on skills, there's work on technology, and here is work on, getting the energy going, that will, convince investors eventually. How much steel in the recovery plans? We don't have the recovery plans yet. We have bits and pieces. We will have to analyze that afterwards. But there are the two numbers: 20% for digital, 37% for green transition. That will have a strong push effect, I'm convinced. And what we see at the moment, it's there.
Thank you very much. Judith and Axel, a thought on skills, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions from the session about the way forward. Judith.
Yeah, I guess the challenge for it, as we see it, is that if we take just that 30% that Jos was talking about of workers who undertake a training in a year, and we take out of that 30% those that were trained on health and safety, which you would expect to be a mandatory part of work, then actually the proportion of workers who receive a training is really, really small. I think it's about 8% once you take out health and safety training. So the pace of retraining and programs around retraining which are necessary are colossal when we look at the whole economy. Now, in the sector like the steel sector, where we have extremely established industrial relations and we have a lot of the infrastructure of the training infrastructure over many years, it's about ensuring that we have that anticipation agenda that Gabby was talking about, that we look with the companies and at a sectoral level, at a regional level, with local authorities in the context of the Just Transition territorial plans, to identify where are the workers in different regions who need targeted help in terms of retraining, and then to pull together the different actors, public authorities, training actors, the social partners at local level, to ensure that we give people that access to training. And for us, it really is a fundamental demand that we push for an individual right for training at European level, because this is where the blockage is often found for many workers, that they just don't have the right to access that training, and then we have to make sure that the training is there to benefit.
Absolutely. Axel, brief thought if you would.
Thank you. Yes, of course, we need to realize that the companies first need to make the investment decision, in most cases for retraining. And once you implement that investment decision, you need at the same time to implement the measures to educate the workers for that. And that's, of course, a challenge which you have to do in a very short term. I also believe that when we are talking, and I support what Joost Korte said, we have the blueprint for skills, there are a lot of measures going on. But when we come to the Just Transition Fund, which is an extremely important tool for the steel industry and for the education for the people, we need to cover, if possible, the whole of the EU steel industry and try to avoid losing half of our companies there. So this is very important. Please, if you allow me, there were also some more questions.
It's going to have to be really short, Axel. We're out of time. I'll have to let our Director General go in a minute.
There were questions on scrap and recycling.
There's lots of questions. Yeah. 30-second one, if you will.
In order to create jobs. And there was a question, stop export of scrap. We say, of course, for the circular economy, we should avoid that scrap is exported to facilities which do not meet the EU standards. And we are asking the Commission to make such a proposal. And that will create also new job opportunities in Europe. The role of recycling steel will even become more important also in Europe. That's for sure. And therefore, these hopefully are two positive answers. And we hope.
Thank you very much. And apologies, there are many detailed questions like that, which we simply don't have time for today in these very short debates. But let me just by way of conclusion, ask each of you, and Gabby, perhaps I could start with you on this last question. We've heard, and I think it was Judith who in our first panel talked about this as a policy jigsaw, and you've all talked about all these different elements coming together. So I'm accepting there is no one key priority for action to really build, going back to the title of our event, an economic and social framework for successful climate transition. But if you had to identify a key next step, what would it be and why? Very briefly, if you would. Gabby first, then Kirsten, then Joost, and then Axel and Judith.
Thank you very much. I think as a first step, it would be really important to have a very clear, coherent approach for certain sectors and regions in terms of this socially Green Deal and the necessary transitions. To have it very clear also on where does the money come from, private and public money. I think we need more cooperation of the different actors. That was very clear here also. And I think in the end, the best thing would be to develop for the sectors and regions a clear roadmap for change, and to say you are not just to people the victim or a person that is dealt with in this transition, but you and the organizations representing you will shape this transition.
Thank you very much.
In a fair way.
Thank you. Kirsten.
Thank you. I'll be very concrete. 7 June, we are having the roundtable on energy intensive industries and the skills. And what we want to do is to discuss what are the challenges in that ecosystem in terms of upskilling and reskilling in order to do this shift. The second point is what's the scale and type of support that you need for this development in the sector. And the third is to obtain commitments from the participants as well, what they can contribute. Of course, we will build on the blueprint, but we need to take this forward. I also want to say that on the 27th of April, we will publish the update of the industry strategy. And here you will find a lot of ideas also for how to take the transition pathways forward. And if I end with an image, the image I would have, what we have to do is a round table where we have everybody around the table shaping, as you said, Ms. Bishop, shaping our future together. There is nobody who will do it for us. We have to do it together. Thank you
Very much indeed. Joost.
Couldn't forget to unmute. Yeah. I mean, just a few words from my side. I think, first of all, I think be honest and recognize that the transition is going to have major impact in certain sectors and certain people. Don't paper over the cracks. I think we are beyond that stage. I think you can only have a successful Green Deal if you have the buy-in and the support of the people, and be honest to them and help them. So strong government policies, and I expect in particular at the macro level or the top level in Europe, a very strong message coming from Porto, that the transitions that we will do and that are good will have to be anchored socially on the basis of the pillar of social rights, and that there will be serious policy responses from Europe and the member states accordingly.
We will be watching closely developments in Porto. Axel.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I think a lot of positive comments have already been made, and all hints to what both Industrial and Eurofair are asking, that is sit together in an action plan for steel, which is part of the wider ecosystem. Ms. Bischoff actually agrees, a kind of roadmap. That is what we need, but we need this very soon. And I think the puzzle will then come together. We have important decisions coming from the Commission, legislative proposals, the Fit for 55%. And there, of course, we need also to ensure that we have this embedded in the discussion with the social partners.
Thank you very much. Judith.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest that we take that figurative table with everybody sitting around it that Kirsten mentioned, and we make it a physical table. We've laid down on the for you what we see as a steel action plan from a worker perspective. Eurofair and Axel have put on the table a steel action plan from the perspective of the industry. The thing that we're missing is the table on which we can negotiate what that looks like together with public authorities and the Commission. So let's move out of the space of webinars and move into the space of actual tables with the policymakers, because this industry is a strategic industry for Europe. It employs a lot of people, and if there isn't a just transition for the steel sector, there won't be a just transition in Europe for any sector. So there is an absolute imperative on the Commission to take what we've put on the table and to see how we can pull it together really into a European steel action plan. And I think, you know, the German steel concept offers you one example of how we can pull in the government into the talks with unions and employers.
So you're not suggesting we all become carpenters, we'll buy the table. The key thing is to get the right people around it. And like you, we all dream of a day when we can meet each other as human beings again. We are almost out of time, but Judith, Axel, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything in a minute or so by way of a closing thought.
Maybe because my microphone's open, I'll take advantage. I'd just like to really say thank you to all of the speakers for accepting our invitation to this event. It is really important to us and urgent. I think the level of participation, I think we got up to something like 200 participants in the webinar, and there are more people watching on YouTube. And looking through the participants list, you have equal numbers of worker representatives and industry representatives and other organizations. So I think I would just like to say thank you for everybody who's been involved, and thanks for an open and frank discussion.
Thank you very much, Axel.
Yes, I fully agree to Judith and share the thanks to all the participants. And it shows that the Commission, also the Parliament, you are taking these issues so serious. And it's really helpful that we have this dialogue is actually starting. But as Judith said, let's sit together now physically as well. And this has an impact also on the globe. There are also participants, not only from the European Union. I have seen that also in the last webinars. There are many overseas Asian participants, and we need to have this discussion with them as well, because Europe takes the lead here, and everyone in the world wants to know the outcome of that, and we need to deliver.
So, and there indeed, Axel, one of the few positives about this world of online meetings is we do reach out to a broader audience and have a conversation with more people than was otherwise possible. I always like to try and emphasize the positive here. Thank you so much again to all of you. Thank you to our first panel. Thank you to you, audience. Apologies that I couldn't squeeze many of the more detailed questions in, but it was great to have so many of you with us. And as was said, the fact that so many signed up for this event underlines just how important it is, and the dialogue we've had, precisely the sort of dialogue that you've all been calling for throughout this discussion. It only remains for me to wish you all a very pleasant rest of the day, and do stay safe. Thank you, panel, and on behalf of the audience, let me do it for them. Bye-bye.